Professorship in the Humanities, and this is my second year in that position, and the best part of it is bringing speakers to campus that hopefully are going to enlighten us and get us to ask questions and talk about the importance of the humanities, and I think I hit a home run already last year and certainly this year as well. I want to give a little background about the East Professorship. The John Franklin East Professorship was established in May 1977 through an endowed gift to Lynchburg College by Margaret East Nelson in memory of her father and in recognition of the East and Nelson family interests in humanities and fine arts. A Norfolk native and businessman, J.F. East served on the Lynchburg College Board of Trustees and was an early and generous benefactor to the college. Earnings from the from this endowment support the professorship, me, thank you, and one or more annual lectures delivered by visiting scholars. And I'm very happy to note that we have two members of the Nelson family here tonight, including Margaret Nelson. The University of Lynchburg expresses its indebtedness to the East and Nelson families for their generous support of the humanities and fine arts at the university. And as we all know, it's a trying time for the humanities, so it's great to have these opportunities. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Elisabeth Anker, Professor of American Studies and Political Science at George Washington University and Director of GW's Film Studies program. She is co-editor of Theory and Event, a journal of political theory, and she has written for several prominent publications like the New York Times, Boston Review, and she appears frequently in news outlets to discuss current events. I first came across Dr. Anker's book, Orgies of Feeling, Melodrama, and the Politics of Freedom a few years ago while planning a Westover colloquia on 9/11 and the War on Terror. And I also was writing a book about spy fiction after 9/11, and I just wanted to skim the book, but I kind of got mad because it was so profound that I'm like, I can't skim this, I have to read the whole thing. And it made me also have to reevaluate what I was doing, which is both a good thing and also a frustrating thing. But I realized that's kind of what I wanted to be in the graduate school mode. I just need to skim this, but you can't. So it was really profound, and when I saw that Ugly Freedoms came out in 2022, I had to get that, and I was excited to have the East Chair and know that I could invite her as a speaker. Freedom is the highest value in American politics, as she notes, but its legacy is complex. Throughout American history, freedom has supported individual liberty, emancipation, and civil rights, but has also supported white supremacy, economic exploitation, and misogyny. These ugly freedoms entail the right to harm and oppress others. This talk with Dr. Anker will examine the ugliness of freedom from the history of slavery to the January 6th insurrection. But it will also highlight visions of freedom that emphasize the flourishing of all people, not just a privileged few. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Elisabeth Anker.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I am really delighted to be here. Thank you, Brian, for that lovely introduction and for the invitation to be here. Thank you so much to Lynchburg in general. It's just really been a pleasure in the short time that I've been here. And I also want to thank the Nelson family for endowing this lecture and for your hospitality. So thank you all very much. There is arguably no higher value than freedom in American politics. It's the foundational value that our country embodies, that citizens desire, and that our government is said to defend. For the historian Eric Foner, these are his words, no idea is more fundamental to Americans' sense of themselves as individuals and as a nation than freedom. Right? According to our revolutionary claims in the Declaration of Independence, all people are endowed with liberty. It's a right that can never be granted or taken by anyone else. And part of what makes Americans into we the people is that we together hold the truth of freedom to be so obvious as to be self-evident. right? Throughout US history, what people have meant by freedom has differed dramatically. It includes things like any of my actions that might not be coerced. It includes things like emancipation from enslavement. It includes participation in governing, full participation. In fact, that's the freedom that we see in the Declaration. It includes individual responsibility for your life. And it includes things like revolutionary action to bring a just and equal society into being. Right? Freedom is also like a notoriously contested concept. Its meaning has shifted in historical moments, and no political theorist in the last 2,000 years, including me, has conclusively defined what it is, even if we all might be invested in our own personal definitions. Right? But even across all these different uses, freedom has always signified the highest of human aspirations and an unassailable value. And yet, while storming the steps of the US Capitol on January 6th, one enthusiastic rioter exclaimed, "I'm here for freedom." And so this might seem odd, right? Especially if we understand freedom to be a righteous value that rejects tyranny and coercion, right? But the insurrection that he was a part of aimed to overpower democratic institutions and force Americans to submit to a presidency that they did not choose. So freedom might see the wrong way for this man to describe his actions in this effort. It might be easy for us then to say that the rioter doesn't exercise freedom, but I actually want to suggest that there's more going on here. One, he likely means the freedom to choose his leaders, especially if he believes, right, however erroneously, that the election was stolen. He also means the freedom of individual autonomy against state tyranny, which is a pretty common definition of freedom in the US. Right? So while it might be easy to claim that his actions don't reflect freedom, I think he challenges us in two ways. One, he draws on familiar definitions of freedom. And more importantly, I think, he discloses a truth about American politics and history to us, which is that popular uses of freedom can entail not merely celebrated practices of freedom like individual liberty or living under the rule of law, but freedom can sometimes also entail acts of domination and harm. Freedom, I want to suggest, is both the highest ideal in American politics and that it can also sometimes be brutal, and I think freedom's ambivalent legacy demands a full reckoning. Right? There are many celebrated practices of freedom, like self-rule, like full participation in governance. These are very crucial for understanding the possibilities of freedom. But large-scale systems of domination, like white supremacy, imperialism, have each unfolded in freedom's name. Imperial control of other states, for instance, is often understood by its practitioners to bring freedom to unfree people. Freedom's not the overarching driving force behind any of these larger systems of power, but it has been used to justify each one of them. And I think it's too reassuring for us to claim that these systems are only falsely justified as freedom, right? That they just use freedom as a fig leaf, let's say, to cover their true motives. Because I think the problem is not that they're like hiding something from us. And I also don't think the problem is that sometimes freedom is subverted by bad actors, right? The problem is that freedom can sometimes legitimately be practiced as subjugation. Throughout US history, freedom has taken shape as things like individual liberty. It has taken shape as emancipation from tyranny, but it's also taken shape as the right to exploit and as the power to harm. Many practices of freedom that we can see all over the place might not end domination. Sometimes they uphold it. So I want to look at examples from what I think is probably the most iconic moment of American freedom, which is the founding. The American Revolution is oftentimes our uber expression of political freedom in the United States, when former colonial subjects liberated themselves from an unjust monarchy where they had no say in government, and they did this in a really radical act of political world-making. Right? They brought a new democratic society into being where one had never been before, and galvanized a form of free citizenship that was not only the protection of individual rights, but it really included the shared making of politics. And yet, as we also know, right, their liberation was only possible because of their widespread land theft from indigenous people who inhabited the land on which they declared independence. So oftentimes violent and world-destroying acts of dispossession were practiced as freedom because they often entailed the freedom of founders to take land in order to be free from monarchy and in order to declare independence. The American Revolution also relied on and was funded in part by enslaved labor. Right? Slavery was made legal in US politics and oftentimes was interpreted by enslavers not as the opposite of liberty, but as the practice of liberty. They understood slavery to entail the freedom to buy and sell without government interference, as well as the freedom of private property. A lot of the language of early slave codes ensured that citizens' freedom, white freedom, was predicated on black slavery. So the system of slavery was not merely considered the opposite of freedom, but it was also considered a practice of freedom for masters. Into the 20th century, claims for men's freedom permitted domestic violence against women because the claim was that a husband's prerogative and privacy took legal precedence over assault. The most popular legal scholarship of the 19th century, written by James Kent, who is considered the American Blackstone, this is what he argued on behalf of husbands, quote, "The law has given him a reasonable superiority and control over the person of his wife. He may even put gentle restraints upon her liberty if her conduct be as such as to require it." In other words, a woman's liberty was at the discretion of her husband, and his freedom included the capacity to control and restrain her if he deemed it necessary. We also know that into the 20th century, racial segregation was justified as freedom. In an infamous speech on segregation, Governor George Wallace of Alabama named his state's refusal to integrate as, quote, "our fight for freedom." And he called segregation, quote, "the ideology of our free fathers." So throughout US history, the pursuit of freedom has clearly supported things like democratic revolution, emancipation from enslavement, protection for workers, support for businesses, and political movements for equality. But it has also legitimated slavery, gender-based violence, and sometimes even environmental destruction. Things like, I'm free to consume as many resources as I can pay for. So this is what I call ugly freedom. Ugly freedom names a dynamic when practices of freedom produce harm, brutality, or subjugation as freedom. So to call freedom ugly is to emphasize how something that is such an important celebrated value can sometimes be practiced through harm and injury. Typically, if we call a political action free, that means this action is principled and noble, that it's in the best interest of all people, and oftentimes the most desirable choice in a field of action, even if sometimes it's the hardest choice. But ugliness as a political assessment tries to target how freedom can sometimes support what we might imagine to be its opposite. Ugliness in the realm of art and aesthetics will name disruptive experience to someone's expectations of something that would be desirable or symmetrical or orderly. And so I want to deploy the kind of the artistic and aesthetic term ugliness to highlight the way that freedom is understood and really to problematize the exclusively positive way that freedom is typically understood, to highlight some of the violence that can be practiced in its name. I think we see ugly freedoms and also challenges to it in different places today. Across the country, we see new bills for education freedom that might outlaw discussions of racism or the fullness of American history in classrooms. We also see forms of ugly freedom in movements for health freedom, which sometimes, especially during the pandemic, asserted that wearing masks to protect the immunocompromised limited the individual freedom of choice. I have a couple of slides here. I kind of pick on Florida because it's my home state, so I feel extra particular about it. Right, but each of these different activities used the language of freedom also to justify harm and to narrow the scope of democracy. Ugly freedoms prevail, I think, anytime freedom is used to harm individuals or to justify injuring them, or to limit citizens' participation in public affairs, which is the cornerstone of a free government. So I want to just look more closely at health freedom for one moment, which at the time when it started arising as a term in mid-2020, relied on two very familiar freedoms. One, the principle of individual sovereignty, right, that I am sovereign over myself and my body, and two, limited government power over personal decision-making, right? Both of those really kind of central freedoms. And yet the refusal of people to distance or to wear masks also made all other people around those practicing health freedom much more vulnerable to a deadly disease, especially before people were vaccinated. And it also actively thwarted public health efforts, which is why COVID-19 was significantly more deadly in the United States. So freedom meant freedom to be free from masking, but it also meant to be free from responsibility to other people and to be free from the burden of other people who might be more vulnerable, right? To be free from worrying about making other people more vulnerable. There could have been other ways to imagine health freedom, right? It might have called for a health freedom that demanded good quality health care for all people, or robust resources to fund vaccines and solutions. And these would be versions of freedom that might be grounded in a sense of realizing that we all live together and are interconnected with one another, that we all are accountable for the people who are in our community, and also respect for the bodily integrity of people who are the most vulnerable. But instead, health freedom ended up enacting a freedom that was a freedom to harm other people, and also to be free from them and from their vulnerability. And yet, while I think we can see some ugly freedoms in society, I would also suggest that we see other forms of freedom that are trying to argue that freedom has to be about increasing participation in public affairs and increasing access to power rather than limiting it. So one freedom I would like to suggest was a recent bill that was called the Freedom to Vote Act, which is a freedom that argues freedom requires free and equal participation of all people in crafting politics. Here's the Freedom to Vote Act. This was a freedom that was arguing that freedom can't just benefit some people, right? It has to benefit all people. The bill aimed to increase voting access around the country by making it easier for every single American to vote, right? By making Election Day a public holiday so that people who might otherwise be, have to go to work would be allowed to vote, or people who make money through hourly wages would be able to participate in voting, requiring same-day registration so that anybody can access even if they hadn't registered before, and allowing for more early voting. The freedom in the Freedom to Vote Act insisted that everybody had to have equal power to shape governing systems, and it was trying to make it easier for everyone to vote, not just people like of one political party or another, which I think would be a freedom to narrow, right, that would narrow participation rather than expand it. Yet, as we know, the Freedom to Vote Act did not pass the Senate. Another case is a case before the Supreme Court yesterday about social media, which is sort of a dueling freedoms issue. Right? On the one hand, we have the freedom from technology companies, which argue that everything on their platforms must be considered free speech, and it has to be protected. But we also heard counter-arguments from the state of Texas and the state of Florida that were arguing that people actually need to be free from the manipulations, disinformation, and brutality of speech on social media, right? For instance, by arguing that editing somebody's face into a pornography video is not free speech, but manipulation, cruelty, and an attack on somebody's freedoms. So like any claims, when any person or institution is claiming to be exercise freedom, I think we should never just take that claim at face value, and we should always be asking the question of, is this a freedom that targets people for harm or that tries to protect people from harm? Is this a freedom that gives people more of a say in the conditions that govern their lives? Or is this a freedom that is trying to limit people's ability to have a say over the conditions of their lives? I don't think any use of the language of freedom to justify someone's actions should ever get a free pass. And every use of freedom, including those that we might personally cherish or be close to our values, should always be subject to this kind of questioning. Something like the Freedom to Vote Act, or even the freedom of, about social media that's in front of the Supreme Court right now, these are rather straightforward reclamations of freedom in the sense that we know where to find them. These are freedoms that might be exercised in legislation, in the halls of Congress, in the law, even in social movements. And in my thoughts about ugly freedom, and in the book from which my talk is coming today, I am really interested in a second and different type of ugliness when it comes to freedom. So if the first ugly freedoms are freedoms that claim to be acting in our highest ideals, but in fact justify harm, I'm interested in another type of freedom that might be about people making sure that all people have a say in the conditions that govern their lives, but it's a freedom that might not necessarily be beautiful or ideal or seeming to be deeply desirable. Right? There are freedoms that might be deemed ugly or undesirable because they might seem to be things that would disappoint us, or might not seem to be the freedoms we imagine if we only have the vision of like a, revolution to independence in our minds. These are freedoms that might include dependence, right, where we're actually not independent from other people, or we're not freedom not as self-reliance, but freedom where we're actually reliant on other people. These might include freedoms where we might feel that some of our agency is blocked. So in other words, where our agency is not robust, we're not uncoerced, but where we might actually be limited in what we're able to do in some way. And also sometimes freedom in things that might be morally compromised or murky, right, where behavior might not be as exemplary as we might imagine. So I am really interested in what freedoms might be possible in some of these spaces that we imagine to be unfree, like things like dependence on others or obstructed agency, relying on others. If most versions of freedom might reject reliance on others, or they might ban weakness, I'm interested in what unexpected freedoms might be found in those spaces, freedoms that actually might be more accessible and more around us in our daily lives than we might otherwise imagine. So in my book, Ugly Freedoms, I'm interested in freedoms that might be found in situations that would seem uninspiring, or because they might not conform to our understandings of ideal freedom, or because the people practicing them might not be the image of the exemplary citizen, or because these freedoms might seem too weak to qualify for the grand description of freedom. And I want to suggest that some of these practices might actually offer us more livable and less brutal visions for what freedom can entail. So I want to connect my initial critique about certain forms of freedoms as harmful and ugly in that sense with a second type of ugliness, practices of freedom that might seem somewhat too small or distasteful, but can also teach us something new about freedom in everyday life where we might otherwise overlook it. So I want us to see how encounters with things that might otherwise be deemed ugly or undesirable can also spurn us to be more creative and capacious citizens. So one site for studying ugliness in the second valence comes from the Jewish philosopher and scholar of religion Moses Mendelssohn, who was a founding thinker of the Jewish Enlightenment in the 18th century. That's Mendelssohn. According to Mendelssohn, I'll say, he notes in some of his work that ugliness is not actually just a judgment about aesthetics, but oftentimes it's a social judgment that we place on people and cultural practices that might be unfamiliar, or they might be deemed backwards or irrational or outmoded. And he notes at the time when he's writing in Europe that oftentimes this is the reason that ugliness was attaching to Jewish people. According to the scholar Leah Hochman, a historian, Mendelssohn's personal experience, where he was often designated ugly, allowed him to generate a philosophy where encounters with ugliness can actually do really important work. They can challenge our kind of knee-jerk revulsions to the things or people that might be just dismissed as ugly. And they can inspire what he called a social conviviality through encounters with difference. He showed us that ugliness is not just an aesthetic judgment, but a political one, and one that was often used to frame judgments about minority participation in civil society. So he aimed to both generate access for minority participation in the social, right, for the people who were deemed ugly and outmoded, and also to produce new forms of connections among people, connections that didn't rely on hierarchies of who was the most beautiful or the most virtuous in Europe at that time, but where people learned how to promote mutuality across differences without trying to silo and make hierarchies. So he argues that encounters with ugliness, especially things that are socially produced as ugly, teach us how to imagine and articulate and feel what a society that would be separate from domination and instead constituted by diverse mutuality, what that would look like. So his challenge to ugliness is not trying to say that everybody in the world is beautiful. In fact, he's trying to challenge the ways in which the beautiful can become a form of political violence that excludes the people who are not deemed as such. Another site for thinking about ugly freedoms comes from a new and important book called Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, where the scholar Saidiya Hartman unearths the second form of ugly freedom. She studies how poor young Black women in the early 20th century experimented with freedom in ways that were deemed unacceptable and disrespectful at the time, especially amidst rising white supremacy. These freedoms, which she argues, included, quote, the errant path taken by the leaderless swarm, free love, and what she called the right to opacity, right, the right to kind of a private life. That these freedoms were enacted by women who were living in dingy urban tenements with no chance of leaving them, and that these places then became the site of their freedom. She writes, quote, a small rented room was a laboratory for trying to live free in a world where freedom was thwarted, elusive, deferred. Places like the hallway, bedroom, stoop, and kitchenette provided the spaces for experimentation. So Hartman is pointing to freedoms that were overlooked because they didn't take place in celebrated places of public freedom like the public square, and also because the women who were experimenting with these freedoms did not conform to freedom's claims and images of virtuous and valiant personhood. She argues that wayward Black women at the start of the 20th century, who might have been dismissed as having nothing to offer free practice, instead harnesses the resources at hand to seize and invent new freedoms, and that we only had to look to be able to find them. She's not trying to argue that dingy tenements are always the space of freedom, but on her reading, these wayward acts referred to freedoms that were crafted in worlds that were otherwise disparaged by the majority population as ugly. And their forms of agency might have seemed non-spectacular, but that they were actually world-making. So like Mendelssohn and Hartman, I want to suggest that sometimes these freedoms can be found in discarded places by people who are deemed by dominant society as having nothing to offer freedom. These are freedoms that they practice that rely on experimentation. They are based in conditions of dependence sometimes, in spaces that are not hallowed, but they are also freedoms that never rely on brutality and that often rely on trying to figure out how to live a flourishing life in ways that don't harm others. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time today talking about one particular contemporary example of this second type of ugly freedom, which is a sigh of boredom in a teacher's lounge. Certainly not all sighs of boredom in a teacher's lounge will express freedom, most do not, but in the instance that I want to examine, where teachers are asked to conform their teaching to standardized metrics that undermine the learning of their students, one teacher's sigh of annoyance leads to another's knowing eye roll, and pretty soon the contagious affects of anger and disaffection lead to a collective rejection of their kind of bureaucratic overlords to a space of imagining the classroom as a new type of freedom. So I'm going to explore this briefly, both by looking at a cultural product from the early 21st century and also through the ugly freedoms of what some people will call neoliberalism, right? That changes in the political economy of our current political economy of capitalism that are often glossed in good ways and in bad ways as neoliberalism. A lot of these shifts are well known. The shifts that are called neoliberalism include the deregulation of corporate profit making, the focus rather on giving back to the community, just on shareholder profits, includes privatizing a lot of our public goods, and it includes reducing state support for social services. The scholar Wendy Brown states that neoliberal policies sometimes entail, quote, wielding liberty claims like weapons to dismantle communities and social worlds, and also to dismantle democratic politics when they stand in the way of capital flows. Many scholars of neoliberalism emphasize that it's unstoppable takeover of political, economic, and social spheres. And yet I want to suggest today that looking at this moment of boredom actually shows us that these neoliberal policies are often significantly weaker than they appear and can often be challenged much more readily accessibly than we might otherwise imagine. Even if they might not be in these heroic and vaunted acts of freedom, they might be much smaller and more compromised. The world view of neoliberalism, also where we all are supposed to govern ourselves like market actors, is often simply just unpersuasive to the people who are asked to do that. So I'm going to look at some of these challenges to neoliberalism and the claims its claims for freedom through the television show The Wire. It is one of the probably the top one or two most acclaimed television shows in the history of television. It is a serial drama about life in Baltimore, and it was often considered at the time of its release the Greek tragedy for the modern age. So for all of you who have not seen it or think it's like a dad show, I totally encourage you to watch it. It's amazing. The Wire was a watershed moment in the history of television, widely considered one of the best shows because of the ways in which it tracked the transformation of a major American city from one where, with a lot of problems, but also a lot of community work, to one that started to be governed from above by a lot of these neoliberal transformations. And yet, contrary to its reception as a show that reveals the power of neoliberalism, I actually want to argue that The Wire shows many of the ways that neoliberalism is obstructed. Maybe not at the most inspiring levels, but also at some of the weakest and smaller, most local regions of the city, sometimes the spaces that were even the most neglected. These promising challenges to neoliberalism in The Wire are often overlooked precisely because they don't seem to be revolutionary, rousing, or dramatic acts of resistance. They're often might not even feel that satisfying to us, as we'll see in this example. They often, what they do is open a space for us to show how practices of freedom might be easily overlooked, even when they're disappointing, but they are still viable. So in The Wire, many institutions in the city take on a kind of neoliberal rationality where a lot of public services stop judging their effectiveness by whether or not they're serving the public and start to judge their effectiveness by whether or not they're saving the city money and whether or not they are constantly increasing their metrics of growth. And yet, while many of the institutions follow this rationality, most of the people working in these institutions care really deeply about their community and public life and actually don't take on these rationalities. The uncompelling nature of these neoliberal claims are revealed by teachers in a middle school. This is the first show of the 4th season, which is about the defunding of public schools and also about the shift in education from qualitative assessments of learning and teacher autonomy to quantitative metrics that primarily measure efficient use of resources and constant growth on standardized testing. The school that is featured in The Wire has no money, and the Baltimore City disinvests in its teachers by forcing them to take on all of the risk and responsibility for educating poor students in a defunded school system. So in a 45-second clip of a teacher's meeting that we're about to watch, and that could be very easily missed, we see educators sitting in rows as a paid speaker lectures them on what to do when they feel challenged by their job. They are to repeat to themselves IALAC, an entirely mouthful of an acronym that stands for I am lovable and capable. So in Baltimore's cash-strapped educational system, money is spent not on material, not on supportive programs for youngsters, but on a private contractor advising seasoned educators to repeat a childlike mantra and suggesting that the best thing that teachers can do is just remind themselves that they're valuable and that will both make them feel better about their job challenges, but more importantly, perform them efficiently and raise student test scores. So let's watch this clip and see how the teachers respond. The one thing I also want to note is this is a 45-second clip, and in the middle there is about a 15-second clip that is showing a parallel meeting that is going on with police officers who are having a kind of similar meeting about what does it mean to do community policing versus policing for metrics. We're not going to focus on that. I'm not going to forward through it because it's too short. But we can also talk about the way in which the show is trying to make parallels among these different public institutions in Q&A. So I am going to go to this, and I am going to hope that this clip shows right away. Okay. Also, do you know if the volume is working? All right, let's try. Like that?
No, you know what I think? Maybe get out of.
We might also be able to, I can pull it up in about 20 seconds on YouTube.
Yeah.
Was another option.
Okay.
I think the problem is that you're in slideshow mode, so it won't let you change anything.
Okay. So end slideshow.
Okay, yeah.
And
And
try clicking on it.
Thank you.
although it's not going to be, it's only going to be.
I could just go right to YouTube. Let's
Okay,
try
yeah,
that.
Probably.
Okay.
What was the acronym again?
I am going to, IAL, let me just see if this is what pulls up. Great. Okay. Let me just try to turn the volume up from this angle. Let's see. All right, we got it. Maybe. Did I speak too soon?
Questions you ask, or their comprehension of the lesson,
Sorry.
but how they perceive you as an educator. And where does that begin? Out loud and enthusiastically. I-A-L-A-C. Let's go. Once again. I-A-L-A-C. And what are we telling ourselves? I am lovable and capable. Now I see those smiling faces.
Where the listing on the lower half of the page indicates some typical soft target locations, an officer alert to the terrorist threat must ask himself, do I know the location of my soft targets? Those where large numbers of civilians congregate. Train terminals, office buildings, stadiums.
Another hot zone in the classroom is the pencil sharpener, where children tend to congregate. And
I had a pencil sharpener in my class once. Antoine Grandison ripped it from the wall and threw it at me.
I'd like to know what your lesson plan suggests when Harold Houndshell sends a full set of textbooks through a closed window. Thank you.
Okay. All right, let's see if we get this. Yay. All right. All right, perfect. Okay. So what's happening here, right? The allure of IALAC to the education system is that it will increase student performance with a pretty cheap investment, right? It presumes that with a few affirmative phrases, teachers will lift up their own morale, with the main goal to be improving student test scores. The lecturer turns this phrase into an acronym as a way to make its message more efficient, but it really just turns it into nonsense, right? IALAC is like harder to remember than the actual phrase, right? The scene lays bare, in this sense, the ineffectiveness of the kind of norms that assume, first, that an acronym encouraging self-love can change the performance metrics of teachers who fundamentally lack resources and support, and second, that the burden for educating impoverished students in an underfunded school should fall squarely on teacher self-investment rather than community self-investment. And more importantly for my argument today, teachers don't buy it. I'm not sure if you could see like the contrast there. Few of the teachers find meaning in this exercise to rebrand their teaching as the freedom to invest in their own lovability. Right? The reverse shots of the lectures pan across a swath of bored, eye-rolling, even actively hostile teachers. And they are crucial for us to undoing the norms of IALAC. Right? We see a couple diligent teachers paying attention, but most of them are shooting dirty looks, they're dozing, we literally see them playing on their phones. Some of them, I don't know if you could see, they're literally passing notes back and forth as if they are sixth graders, right? And most of them are ignoring the teacher altogether. They are together performing disinterest. And I think their boredom establishes a barrier, a refusal to incorporate these directives that they feel go against the conditions of their classroom. Their eye rolls are communicating, right? An eye roll is not usually something you do to yourself. You do it to communicate. And the eye rolls are performing that communication, showing that what's happening is so fundamentally uncompelling that it's not worthy of engagement, right? It's a subtle but profoundly communicated dearth of enthusiasm. And it's an intended performance of inflexibility. It shows disregard to what they are saying, right? If neoliberalism offers an ideal of workers as always enthusiastic and flexible in reaching performance metrics, this scene shows its opposite, right? The teachers' eye rolls and performances of disinterest reject this kind of rationality and reject the cruel location of student learning in their individual capacity to find themselves lovable. And in the very end of this scene, it got cut off like right at the very end. It should have gone on for 3 more seconds, but something different starts to happen. The teachers begin to talk back to the speaker, disrupting the presentation, quickly ending it all together by pointing out its senselessness and its inability to address their real job conditions. Right after 2 teachers in succession insist that the presenter's techniques for classroom management bear no relation to their daily experiences, the whole room erupts in anger. In the last few seconds, the teachers shut down the presentation. This eruption was probably unplanned and uncoordinated. There's nothing to let us imagine that it was coordinated beforehand. But it's also likely that it only happened because of all of their accumulated small acts of noncompliance that they had throughout the presentation, and then the contagiousness of their affective disaffection. Their performances of boredom connected teachers and turned them into collaborative resistors once a few of their peers spoke up. This is certainly not a dramatic performance of resistance, but it is a clear rejection of the institutional imposition of a kind of neoliberal rationality that disinvests in them and then forces them to take on all of this responsibility with no support. Of course, what also makes this somewhat disappointing and not like a robust act of freedom that we might desire is that what substitutes for the school system's inability to compel this cheap self-investment is not necessarily all of a sudden successful learning, right? This is not a beautiful moment in that sense. It's certainly not an ideal performance. And it's very easily overlooked in the narrative of the show. In fact, a lot of people who like The Wire and watch it often don't even remember this small scene, right? Teachers here, no matter how hard they work, struggle to educate their students. Their rejection of IALAC is not a celebratory revolt. It doesn't lead to a vast restructuring of the educational system that overthrows biased standardized testing or prioritizes community decision-making, bringing well-funded wraparound support services to students, or making the classroom a safe and joyful place to learn. Right? There's no kind of false melodrama here, a victory for the underdogs. But their actions and the actions of the teachers also signal that they have no problem tossing aside some of these unjust institutional impositions in favor of both a form of self-worth for themselves as teachers, but also a sense of collaborative solidarity with other teachers that shuns the desperation of this kind of lack of investment. Their actions might be small and unsatisfying, but they're not nothing. And in fact, I would suggest they're quite important, even when they're small and compromised, coming from a space where they're dependent on others for their action and where they don't have robust agency. So I want to end by saying a focus on small, overlooked, I'm not sure, let's see if this will move us forward anymore. It's okay, I'm going to leave it here as the wire. A focusing on small, overlooked, sometimes unappealing acts of freedom is not to say that large-scale acts of freedom are wrong or impossible, but it is to say that when we imagine freedom as only ever ideal, we overlook some of the neglected but accessible freedoms that are more available to us in everyday life. I want us to find worth in actions that might otherwise be disparaged as worthless or ugly without trying to recoup them back into standards where they have to be ideal or perfect. So the phrase ugly freedom has a double meaning. In the first meaning, as a critique, it challenges certain freedoms when they're understood as unproblematic ideals to show the ways in which they can produce harm and injury. But in the second meaning of ugly freedoms, it identifies alternative practices of freedom that might be disparaged or seem deflating, but in the context that I examine them, they can reflect life-affirming freedoms that don't rely on excluding or opposing others, that build from our social interdependence with others rather than trying to dismantle it, and that also help to cultivate shared practices of world-making to help to rejuvenate our world. We might erroneously presume that beauty is what gets us through the difficulties of the world, but perhaps sometimes it's also ugliness that gets us through. Thank you very much. Great, and I am happy to, yeah, absolutely. If people have any questions about any aspect of this or examples of freedoms we might want to think about in this way, or even questions about the talk, or arguments with any aspect of it, please feel free. Yes, please.
On one of the slides, you had a picture of a mask for COVID, and it said COVID 1984. Is
Yes.
that based on Orwell's book?
Yes, it was a claim that wearing masks was so dystopian and Orwellian, like 1984, where you're being surveilled all the time and your thoughts are being surveilled, right? That the masks themselves were a form of, like total control over your thoughts and actions. Yeah, thanks for that. Yes, please.
This is sort of off the wall, but and you don't have to answer it. And I really thank you for your presentation. But have you given any consideration to Angela Davis's meaning of freedom and to her sister Fannie Davis's ideas of restorative justice? Because they both relate really strongly to what you're talking about.
Thank you. Angela Davis's work is important to mine, especially the ways in which, on the one hand, she critiques the ways that sometimes our positive languages about what we imagine politics to be can often be incredibly violent, right? The way she, especially the way in which she connects languages of freedom to mass incarceration and imprisonment. Restorative justice to me, like so many things, depends on exactly how it's being used, what is being justified under its mantle. And I think there are many ways when this is something that a community agrees on and a community feels satisfied about a project, that, about restoring justice after harm has been done. If that is something that a community comes together and supports and feels like is the right course of action, that to me is a practice of freedom, right? Because it's people coming together, working as a community, making sure that there is dignity for everybody, especially the person who has been harmed by somebody else's actions, and that the community feels that a right path forward has come out of an action of harm or violence, right? I mean, that's, of course, in its best ways. There are many ways in which it isn't practiced in that way, but yes, one would hope. So thank you for that question. Yeah, great. Please.
Thank you for your talk. I found it really exciting. And I love the show, and I think a lot of the professors here would identify, especially those of us who taught in public high school, would identify with that moment. I wonder if you could say more. I'm very excited by the idea that this tiny act that doesn't seem laudatory or taking place in a public square, nonetheless is a practice of freedom. I also noticed, though, in this clip, what I'm recognizing is the practice of critique, right? Like they're sort of claiming a kind of expertise that the speaker doesn't share in that expertise. They're kind of rejecting her acronym as a meaningful form of knowledge about their lived experience. So is there, in your work, is there a relationship between these sort of private acts of ugly freedom? I guess maybe what I'm asking is, do they have to enable a kind of critique of, in this case, neoliberalism, or are those two concepts independent?
Thank you. It's a great question. There is a sense of critique that comes out of it, but it's also a form of agency, right? It's not only a kind of a pointing out or deconstructing of the problem itself, because they also stop the meeting, which is the part of, right? If they were just saying if nothing happened from it, or saying this doesn't address our job conditions, and it was well, okay, that's true, but this is exactly what you have to do, and enjoy following it, and goodbye. I think that would be different than the way in which something came out of that criticism, right, to do something different here, in the way in which it actively stopped the event. And you never, ever again, throughout the show, see teachers. There are many different forms of of ways of trying to control teachers in the film, in the show, but we never again see IALAC. We never see teachers investing in that, and there's a way in which it seems like this has come and gone. And so one of the writers of The Wire, who was a police officer who then turned educator, mentions in some of the commentary at this moment, right, that part of what they're trying to do, he's even marveling. He's like, I sat there and I could not believe they actually paid people to do something like this. And I think, part of it is that they are trying to show the ineffectiveness of it, or the way in which, it doesn't correlate at all, and the way in which it was not actually that hard for teachers to challenge it. But we can also think of something different, right? If each teacher was individually had to meet with the principals are the two people standing in the back, right? If they had to each meet with the principal individually and were taught IALAC individually, it is unlikely that any teacher would have felt the kind of strength or courage to push back against it. They might not have adopted it per se, but they needed each other in that room to have that act of saying, teaching is something more than this, and also that it doesn't match what we do here, right? They couldn't have done it without each other. And I think that's also part of the action. The critique is there, but there's something about the actions, the way they are in community with one another. And we know, we see these guys behind the scenes all the time. It's not like they all love each other. They're certainly not all best friends. And I think there's a real politics to that, coming together around, a shared project, even when you don't agree with people on other things. But on this issue, we're going to come together and work together on it. So there seems like that aspect of politics that has to be there for it. So does that help? Yeah, great. Thank you for the question. Great. Yes, please.
So you showed this clip in The Wire. You mentioned that you worked with film studies.
Yeah.
Can you think of any other moments in media that represent moments like this? I'm thinking of The Breakfast Club.
What scene in The Breakfast Club are you thinking of?
Basically the end in which they write the paper and they're following the rules, but they're also saying, we don't agree with you. Then we do agree.
I love that reading of The Breakfast Club. I think you just did the work, right? You've written the sequel. No, I would totally agree with that reading, and I've never thought of that. It was a favorite movie of mine when I was younger, and I never thought of thinking about the end in that way, but I think you're entirely right? It's these people, they come together, they're all really different. They don't necessarily leave being best friends, but they leave understanding each other in a much deeper way that they didn't before. And in part, that's because they're all in detention, but they also reject the claims about what detention was supposed to do and what it was supposed to foment, and that's part of that letter where they're adhering to the letter of the law, but also rejecting some of the more, kind of dictatorial conditions, we could say, that put them there. So I would exactly think of that as a moment of ugly freedom. And I would also suggest, like, there's, once you start thinking about these smaller practices, they're actually much more available than we might otherwise think. And something that I'm working on right now is my concern sometimes that because freedom is such an ideal, that sometimes we miss out on all the ways in which freedom is more accessible in our lives because we imagine that, well, freedom you have to be like a revolutionary founding father, or you have to be like a heroic resistor leading a movement. And oftentimes those models of heroism and mastery and power might not be available to people in their everyday lives when people are working jobs and have caretaking responsibilities, or burdened by the small bureaucracies of our communities or whatever. But when we actually start to look for some of them, they're much more available than we might otherwise imagine. And I think they pervade our lives in ways that, that freedom's much more accessible to us in that way. So when we get rid of the claim that freedom can only be ideal, practiced by an ideal subject who is a hero and super courageous, when we move that out of the way, we think about all the ordinary practices of freedom that we can access where we might not think of ourselves as the hero of all time, and that's okay. So, right, so yes, thank you for that. Great, other questions?
One more.
Yes, please.
A lot of your examples, you juxtapose one freedom with another. And so the question in my mind that just kept coming up as you were speaking is, whose freedom?
Yeah. I mean, go ahead, please.
Justice, for example, or the freedom to operate a business the way you want, versus the freedom to breathe clean air, or have clean water. Do you address that in your work and how those power dynamics work?
Yeah. To me, that question of whose freedom is the most important question. The question that I think is at the heart of what we should always be asking, right? When I teach about freedom with my students, and sometimes, they're like, well, I always just thought if somebody said that they were free or acting in freedom, like, you can't challenge that. You can't, right? That's their freedom, and you can never challenge somebody else's freedom, and that's that. And I actually kind of think the opposite. Not that we should sit and be challenging everybody, but that question of always, right? I don't think the issue is whether this is a real freedom or a fake freedom, because like both of the freedoms that you said are real, right? For example, right? The freedom to operate my company in the way that I see fit, and the freedom to not pollute the environment, and the freedom to breathe clean air, right? Those are each freedom. So I don't think that the way to approach it is not like, is this a real or fake freedom? Is this the right is this, fake or what have you? But who is benefiting from this freedom, right? What does the actions of this freedom entail? Whose freedom is it, and who benefits? And sometimes that answer is harder to weigh, and sometimes it's easier, right? The way I think about it is always, are we expanding freedoms in this freedom, or are we narrowing them down, right? Who is benefiting from this? Is it more people who are allowed to benefit, or less, right? Is this a freedom that is expanding people's capacity to live a flourishing life, or is it narrowing people, or only allowing a few people to live a flourishing life? And so to me, when we ask those sorts of questions, exactly like who and what does that look like, that can help us to evaluate freedom, rather than, on the one hand, either just saying, okay, you said it's free, like it's unquestioned, or to, the opposite, which is just to say, freedom right or wrong, or your freedom's, that's a fake freedom because I don't agree with it. right? Because of course we're all going to have our own values about what freedom is. We're going to practice it differently. It's going to mean something different to us depending on our jobs and life experiences. But I think the question we should always be asking, and asking ourselves, right? It's not like we get a free pass either, is always, when I claim that this is an act of freedom, who's benefiting? Whose freedom is this, am I claiming? Am I expanding freedoms for people who might not otherwise have access to them? Or am I narrowing it just to me or to other people? And what do we, how do we manage that? Because we do live in community with people. So, yeah, thanks. Great.
Well, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Anker. Let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Oh, thank you. Hi. There is an Audible version of my book, yes. If you want to email me, I can send you the link to it. I'm pretty sure it's just on Audible online, but I can send it to you. Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for your question. Hi. Yeah.
I used to teach
What was your field? I'm sorry, I meant like what, like within history?
medieval European.
Oh, wow. Okay, very cool.
But I look at medieval European history from an Afrocentric view.
Wow.
You may have guessed that.
Yeah. I have a couple colleagues who are doing that at GW right now.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's such an important and like exciting field right now. So, yeah.
And so as a teacher, I identify a lot with what you're saying.
Yeah.
And what frustrated me as a teacher is when we would get together for those like teacher lounge things.
Yeah.
And all the other teachers would be racking on the students instead of sharing how they could be more effective teachers and learn from each other.
Oh.
And there's a wonderful program called Black Minds Matter. I don't know if you...
I haven't heard of it.
It is incredible. You might want to check it out. Because it's
Black Minds Matter?
Black Minds Matter. It's about
While we're doing here, so
affirming young black men in the classroom. And it has brought together educators, black educators, male and female, all over the country. And they've had 3 iterations of the program that took place during the pandemic. And so they were available, and you can still find them on YouTube.
Oh, cool. I will check this out.
And they're absolutely fascinating. And one of the things they do talk about is teachers getting together and sharing what works. And not only what works, but what works for all the students.
Sorry. It's okay.
For all the students, white, black, Latino.
Yeah.
The things that provide good education for all of them. And they look at the schools that do that and the methods that they use that produce those results.
Oh, wow. I would love to see this.
And the reason I mentioned Fannie Davis is she's so interesting. She was Angela Davis's sister.
I actually did not even know Angela. I mean, I read all of Angela Davis' work, and I didn't even know she had a sister. So I feel like you taught me something new. So I actually.
And check her out. She has a thing called the Little Book of Race and Restorative Justice.
Okay.
And her take on restorative justice is so interesting. Restorative justice really has been proven to improve the teaching atmosphere in schools.
Oh, wow. They do it in my kids' school, so I get that, yeah.
There's huge body of evidence to that, but it doesn't reduce the difference in suspension rates of black students.
And that's because it's the teachers who are suspending them? Is that part of it?
That's part of it, and it has to be incorporated with a program of racial awareness. Or one educator I'm working with here in the public school says cultural competencies.
Yeah.
And then you'll start to see a reduction. She tried it in the Oakland schools, and I used to live in Oakland before I moved here.
Ah, me too.